Honourable Member for Bruce Grey Owen Sound.
Mr. Speaker, as a retired colonel in the Canadian Armed Forces and a proud Legion member, every year I wear the poppy with great pride, taking time to remember those who have served before me, those that still serve, and those that made the ultimate sacrifice. I was shocked and even more disappointed to read this morning that Whole Foods grocery stores, in an affront to our veterans, have banned their employees from wearing poppies. I trust this misguided policy will be reversed immediately and Whole Foods will allow their employees to wear poppies again. Without our veterans, Canada would not be the country we are so proud to call home. Other nations like the Netherlands understand this. Why don't Whole Foods? In this vein, tomorrow at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Global BC will premiere the documentary 75 Years Later, The Sounds of Freedoms on their YouTube channel to pay tribute to Canadians that took part in World War II and specifically those that liberated the Netherlands. I encourage all Canadians to watch this broadcast in honor of those who gave their lives for Canada and the Netherlands. Wear the poppy with pride, lest we forget.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Preston, Chessie Cook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Remembrance Day, Canadians will remember those who lost their lives serving in the Canadian Forces and thank those who served and continue to serve. From Passchendaele to Kandahar, Canadian soldiers have a proud history of serving in the most dangerous situation, risking their lives to defend the most vulnerable among us. C'est tellement inspirant de voir.
It's so inspiring to see our communities find ways to come together virtually to ensure that we continue to honour members and former members of the Canadian Forces.
Together in person, but it will never stop us from honouring those who risked everything to defend our freedom and our democracy here and around the world. Nova Scotians have also witnessed incredible tragic moments over the past year, yet the strength, resilience and love in our community only continue to grow. Aujourd'hui, nous nous ressemblons.
Today, we gather to remember those who lost their lives in the service of Canada and to thank those who have served and continue to serve.
Nous nous souviendrons. Merci.
Oral questions. Questions orales. L'honorable député de Carleton.
The Honourable Member for Carleton.
We're all wearing poppies to honour those who served, those who were wounded, those who never came home, for the countless mothers who buried their faces in their pillows in the endless anguish of knowing that they'd never see their daughter or son again. That's why Canadians are so outraged that a billionaire American-owned Whole Foods, a grocery chain, has banned its workers from honouring our soldiers. Will the government join with Canadians in boycotting Whole Foods, saying that we will not give them our money until they let their workers give thanks?
The Honourable Minister.
I thank my honourable colleague for the question, Mr. Speaker, and this is absolutely unacceptable. The poppy is an important symbol of remembrance, and it's more important than ever that everybody supports the Royal Canadian Legion Poppy campaign this year. I know all my colleagues in the House join me in condemning this move and reinforcing the poppy for everyone to remember and honour the service of the people who have provided our democracy and freedom. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Carleton.
Well, the government told us they needed to shut down Parliament to do away with all the distracting questions about their WE scandal and other cover-ups so that they could focus like a laser beam on a new plan to get our economy back. So they've had all this time to themselves, and they came forward with a rent assistance program that doesn't pay rent assistance to anyone who can't afford to prepay their rent. Today, they tried to fix it, but they gummed up the procedure and got ruled out of order. Do they realize that their spectacular incompetence is costing businesses their livelihoods and workers their jobs?
The Honourable Minister. Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I take issue with the honourable member's characterization of our plan. It is because of measures like the wage subsidy, the emergency business account, and various supports, including for commercial rent, that millions of Canadians still have a job to go to that allows them to feed their families. With respect to the Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy, as we enter the second wave of the pandemic across Canada, we have developed a new program that will allow easier access and more targeted benefits to go directly to tenants when their business have suffered a loss of revenue. We will be there for Canadians going forward, as we have been through the course of this pandemic.
Member for Carleton.
Yesterday, the finance minister couldn't say how big the deficit was or the debt or the additional cost of a 1% increase in the interest on our national debt. She couldn't say when there'd be an economic update or a budget. We haven't had one for a record period of time. She couldn't say whether we would be able to provide the necessary information to the Auditor General. Is it because the government doesn't know or because they don't want Canadians to know? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, again, the honourable member is focused on the wrong thing. When the Governor of the Bank of Canada attended before the Finance Committee, when both he and I were present, the Governor informed him that the much bigger risk facing the Canadian economy was deflation, not inflation. I point him to the comments of the chief economist of the IMF, who was on leave from the Department of Economics at Harvard, who said that for the many countries that find themselves at the effective lower bound of interest rate, fiscal stimulus is not just economically sound policy, but also the fiscal responsible thing to do. We will base our decisions on evidence, facts, and we will continue to be there for Canadians through this pandemic.
Honourable member for Calgary Midnapore.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the cat is out of the bag. Finally, after 8 months of waiting, we are expected to see in the coming days a plan for the aviation sector. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to ensure that this plan is for the individuals for which it is intended. So, can the minister assure me that employees will be protected under this plan, that there will be no further layoffs, and secondly, that these funds will not go, Mr. Speaker, to executive compensation?
Honourable Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, we're looking at all the things that my honourable colleague brought up, and I will say that the Government of Canada has provided $1.3 billion in assistance to the air sector through the supplementary wage program. We've also provided about $192 million for remote companies serving remote areas of our country. So we have actually put some plans in place, not to mention the rent holiday for 21 airports during 2020. So we are working on a long-term solution.
Well, member for Calgary Midnapore.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that sounds like the same old empty Liberal promises, lots of words but no action. So I've got two more questions for the minister. Will the minister commit to restoring all regional routes all across Canada? And secondly, will he ensure consumer protection, that the tens of thousands of Canadians across Canada get their money back for the flights they purchased? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Transport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in response to my colleague, I will mention the speech from the throne, which I'm sure she was enthralled listening to, that we did mention in that we were going to ensure that regional routes would be maintained in Canada because we feel it's absolutely essential to treat people living in regions the same way as we do treat people living in the large cities. They have as many rights as others. So we're working on that. And with respect to the question of consumers and vouchers, we are encouraging the airlines to refund where possible.
Deputy.
The honourable member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes, Verchères. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we prepare to pass measures to support businesses today, it's crazy that there's still nothing for the hardest hit industries by this pandemic. None of these measures to save the aviation sector. The planes are grounded, the airports are deserted and left to fend for themselves with their fixed costs. Regional service has been cut off. Carriers like Air Transat are on the verge of going bankrupt. Workers have been laid off. When is this government going to take action for this industry? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. It's a question that he asks me pretty regularly, and my answer is also quite regular. That is that we're working on a comprehensive program to ensure that we can maintain our aviation industry. It's essential to our country, and we're working on solutions. The Honourable Member. Well, you can't wait forever, Mr. Speaker. The Finance Minister didn't want anything for the aviation industry. That's what we learned, and that's why we've been waiting for 8 months with no plan. No plan for regional service, no plan for the airports. The planes, they have to land somewhere. No plan to refund customers. No plan to protect jobs. All Ottawa has done is been Air Canada's lackey by giving them money without any strings attached at the expense of the competition. When will there be an industry-wide plan? The Honourable Minister, as I said, Mr. Speaker, we're working on a comprehensive plan to help the entire industry, including the airlines and the airports. I've been working with my colleague, the Finance Minister, who's well aware of the situation and has publicly acknowledged that the aviation industry is in great difficulty. Thank you.
Monsieur Président.
Mr. Speaker, the eyes of the entire planet were on the U.S. elections this week. We saw all the social division and tension created by social networks. Meanwhile, the Heritage Minister has tabled legislation, and there's nothing about sharing platforms like YouTube. We've done our research. Social networks create hatred, and they propagate falsehoods. Does the minister have a plan to solve this problem? The Honourable Minister.
We tabled legislation that will modernize the Broadcasting Act, the first time that this has been done since 1991. The changes have been welcomed by Canadian creators and those working in the industry. In fact, Jerry Diaz of Unifor, which represents many media workers, said, "The fact is, this would be a huge boost for Canadian media and media workers and their families." Our Minister of Canadian Heritage recently spoke with his French and Australian counterparts on the measures the two countries are putting in place to support their news publishers. We know the importance of local media, and we will continue to work to support them.
The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
The children of Niagara are now in their third week of a forced evacuation, so let's run through this minister's lame Rolodex of excuses for not helping. First, he said Liberals have spent record funding on Niagara. Seriously. Then he said, well, at least Liberals have done more for Niagara than Stephen Harper. Well, here's the thing. Niagara didn't have any clean water under Stephen Harper. Now they have no water under the Liberals. So when he talks about making progress, he means progress going from having no water back to boiled water. Why has this minister completely failed the people of Niagara and their children?
The Honourable Minister or Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, I would like to acknowledge the unacceptable situation in Niagara. I would like to update the House on the current discussions we are having with the Chief. The plan forward involves a staged path to opening the new plant, which we've invested $16.5 million in. And we won't rest until we can repatriate members of Niagara to their community in a safe, COVID-free way. And that is what we are proceeding with in partnership with the Chief. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, the Defence Minister has been secretive about his plans to establish a new Defence Strategic Communications Group. Concerns have been raised by the media about the mandate of this group and whether dossiers and journalists are being collected by his department. Canadians have trust and confidence in our Canadian Armed Forces, but this minister is stoking fear with his failure to give a straight answer. So the minister needs to be clear. Has the Canadian Armed Forces stood up a new Defence Stratcom Group? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister or Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I will be very clear. The Canadian Armed Forces does not conduct influence operations on our citizens. No such plan has been approved, nor will it be. This training is important for international operations because influence activities are used by our adversaries. We must be prepared to respond to malicious foreign actors. This type of training is on pause, as the minister has directed, while the Canadian Armed Forces conducts a thorough review. Thank you.
For Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Parliamentary Secretary didn't answer the question on whether or not defence stratcoms have been stood up. Now, Canadians are proud of our Canadian Armed Forces, and we support them in defending against disinformation operations by malicious foreign actors. But they also expect the defense minister to do his job and reassure them that defense strategic communications will not be politicized by this Liberal government. So I'll ask one more time. Will the defense minister guarantee he will never weaponize and use military public affairs and specifically defense strategic communications against Canadians?
The Honourable Parliament Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, yes, the minister and I have been very clear and continue to be clear that we do not conduct influence operations on Canadian citizens. Military communicators will always respect the privacy of Canadians and our allies, and we will always adhere to the applicable laws, policies, and directives. This is very clear. The minister has made it clear, as am I doing today. Thank you.
The honourable member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, Canadians have to protect themselves against the approaching flu season, but apparently Canada has only enough vaccine for 37% of the population. The last time the government tried to get vaccines for Canadians, they made a strange deal with the communist Chinese regime, which fell through. In a pandemic, vaccines are more important than ever to avoid overwhelming our hospitals. So my question is simple. Will Canada supply the provinces with enough seasonal flu vaccine? The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the member for his question about flu season. In fact, we've delivered on flus in the timely order that is expected by Canadians. And in fact, over 97% of flu vaccines have been delivered to provinces and territories. Many provinces and territories have ordered extra flu to be prepared. And in fact, the demand has exceeded even their expectations. So we'll continue to work with them on other sources to access additional doses of flu vaccine. Thank you.
The honourable member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, it's hard to believe because the government has been slow with almost all decisions about COVID-19. They were slow in closing the border. They were slow in delivering a vaccine because they made a deal with the communist Chinese regime. And now we have the seasonal flu coming. So they don't seem to grasp the urgency of the situation, even in this crisis. When will they learn from their mistakes and adequately protect Canadians? The Honourable Health Minister.
In fact, we have been working with provinces and territories to prepare for flu season. So far, we've seen very low flu activity, and that's good news. And I thank all the Canadians who are stepping forward to get their flu vaccinations this year. It's certainly an important year to make sure we protect our healthcare systems and our families. 97% of the flu shots ordered by provinces and territories have been released well ahead of schedule. We'll continue to work with provinces and territories to look for other sources of additional doses of the vaccine. And Mr. Speaker, again, I thank Canadians for taking this responsibility so seriously.
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is so lost in his little Care Bear world, he doesn't want to offend anyone, even if it means limiting freedom of expression. His own caucus members and cabinet ministers looked the other way when he made unacceptable comments about limits on freedom of expression. Do all Liberals agree with the Prime Minister, who clearly stated that there were limits to freedom of expression? The Honourable Minister of Global Affairs. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for that question. I think it's a bit unfortunate today that this question is being politicized. The Prime Minister was clear that all Canadians were horrified by the attacks, and we expressed our deep, sincere, and concrete solidarity with our French friends. As I said, the day after the attacks, we expressed our full solidarity. And Canada is one of the greatest defenders of freedom of expression in the world, and we will continue to do that. The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, with all due respect for the Minister of Global Affairs, I'd like to remind him he's not the Prime Minister. His messages do not carry the same weight. Clearly the laughingstock of the diplomatic world after the conversation between French President Emmanuel Macron and Quebec Premier François Legault, the Liberal Prime Minister finally spoke with him too. My question is, was he honest with the French president? Did he repeat what he said here, i.e. that he feels that freedom of expression has limits? We're waiting for a clear message. The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, it's standard that when I express myself on behalf of Canadians and on behalf of the Prime Minister. It's all been clear, Mr. Speaker. The only thing that's upsetting here is that they're attempting to politicize an issue. I'm sure they want to defend freedom of expression, as we do. We've made it clear. I've said so on behalf of the Government of Canada. I've spoken to French authorities. Mr. Speaker, we will always stand in defense of freedom of expression, like all members in this Parliament. The honourable member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. Mr. Speaker, as we prepare to pass measures today to provide federal support for businesses, it's crazy. There's still nothing for the industries hardest hit by the pandemic. None of these measures will help the aerospace industry, nor was there anything in the throne speech. It's as if Quebec's main export sector was dead to Ottawa. The industry is completely paralyzed by the pandemic, and 43,000 individuals in Quebec are fearful for their jobs. When is Ottawa going to present a specific plan for the aerospace industry? The Honourable Transport Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. When I talk about a comprehensive plan for aviation, we know that the aerospace industry was affected too, because that's basically the supply chain for the aviation industry. So we're aware of the fact that they've been hit by this pandemic too, and we are taking that into account. Thank you. The honourable member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. It makes no sense, Mr. Speaker. The aerospace industry is the biggest manufacturing industry in Canada, not just Quebec. It doesn't take a genius to realize that in a pandemic, it's difficult when you manufacture planes. They're grounded. Nobody's buying them. It's simple. It's also difficult for small and medium-sized businesses who manufacture parts for those planes. The whole economic fabric of Quebec is at risk. It's the third largest hub in the world, and it is in danger of being taken over by foreign companies because Ottawa's doing nothing. What's it going to take? The Honourable Minister of Transport. I can't really, it's a bit rich for my colleague to be lecturing me on an industry that I know very well, and I know it very well in Quebec. I won't take it. I won't take that kind of comment. We're working on a comprehensive plan. What does he want?
Honourable member for Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Roman is 21. He's suffered his whole life with cystic fibrosis. His lungs function at 40%. Physiotherapy and hospital visits fill up his days. Trikafta can save Roman's life, but it's not here in Canada. When I asked the minister why, she said she's waiting for Vertex to apply. But the real reason, Mr. Speaker, is this government's failed to fix PMPRB pricing regulations that keep innovative drugs like Trikafta out. It's being fast-tracked in other countries, so why is Canada lagging? When will Roman have access to Trikafta?
Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I want to say, that I'm with Roman and his family, and I understand how desperately patients with cystic fibrosis and their families are seeking new treatments that can ameliorate their conditions. And, Mr. Speaker, we've worked with Vertex. We've encouraged them to apply to Health Canada. We've had promising conversations with Vertex, and we stand by ready to rapidly review the drug using evidence from other regulatory bodies. I encourage Vertex to accelerate their work with Health Canada to make sure that we can ensure people like Roman and his family have access to the drug here in Canada.
La députée Louis Saint-Laurent.
The honourable member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, that's the problem. That's all nice talk. But I remember in June we spoke about a case about a woman in my riding. Cystic fibrosis can hit anyone. And there are drugs available in some countries, but it's been months and months and months that we've been waiting for Health Canada's decision. Could the minister give some hope and perhaps pitch in to make sure that victims of this illness can have some hope? The Honourable Health Minister.
I share the Member of Parliament, the Member Opposite's concern that we have not had an application yet from Vertex. Of course, the department has reached out to Vertex, has spoken with the company, has encouraged them to apply. But let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, patients like Roman, patients like the Member Opposite's constituent can apply to the Special Access Program at Health Canada with their doctor's recommendation. So they can access Trikafta in Canada. In fact, the majority of those applications are approved, and I would encourage them to reach out to our office if they need any help with those applications.
Honourable Member for Bruce Grey, Owen Sound.
Mr. Speaker, needless to say, I was surprised but even more disappointed this morning to read that Whole Foods grocery stores have taken the decision to ban employees from wearing poppies. As someone who has served in our military to defend rights, Whole Foods may have the right to establish their own dress code, but taking away rights from their employees and banning poppies that Canadians wear in remembrance of those that have made the supreme sacrifice is just plain wrong. What I do know, Mr. Speaker, is within all Canadians' rights to no longer shop at Whole Foods. Premier Ford has indicated he'll introduce legislation to prohibit employers from banning poppies. Will the Prime Minister do the same?
Honourable Minister or Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, this is absolutely unacceptable. And I know all my colleagues in the House would join me in condemning this move and reinforcing the poppy, make sure the poppy is where it should be, and the veterans are remembered and honored for all their great service. During Veterans Week, it's a time for every Canadian to come together to show their unwavering support for veterans. Veterans provided our peace and democracy, Mr. Speaker. They deserve our respect, and this government will make sure they get it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Lethbridge.
In September 2019, 1 year ago, the Prime Minister promised Canadians that he would plant 2 billion trees in 10 years. In September 2020, 1 year later, we found out 0 trees had been planted. Then in Natural Resource Committee just last week, we found out not only no trees, but there's no plan, no budget for it. So 0 trees planted, no plan in place. Now, I know the Prime Minister thinks that the budget will balance itself. Does he also believe that trees will plant themselves?
The Honourable Minister or Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, we are absolutely committed to planting 2 billion trees. We have been developing a plan based on the areas of land to be planted, the types of trees to be planted, how best to prepare the sites, how to monitor trees for survival. All of this work's been going on in the middle of the pandemic. We're talking about increasing forest cover by an area twice the size of PEI by year 10, and we look forward to releasing our plan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for London Fanshawe.
The Royal Canadian Air Force Association, the 427 Wing, is an incredible resource for veterans in London. It houses 2 museums and resides in a historical canteen from the 1940s. This group has fought hard to keep the wing from shutting down forever because of COVID-19. When this group reached out to assistance from the people of London, they showed up. However, I wrote the Ministers of Veterans Affairs and Heritage over 8 months ago, and I've still heard nothing. Mr. Speaker, will this government finally commit more than just pretty words this Remembrance Day and provide immediate financial support to the wing and veterans?
The Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it's always been my priority to make sure we provide financial support for organizations that do so much for our veterans. And that's exactly what we included, $20 million in Bill C-4 to do just that. I've worked with some of these groups over the years, and I can assure my colleague that we will always be there to support the groups that support veterans right across this country. We owe that to our veterans, Mr. Speaker, and this government will continue